Welcome to the FemiNinja Project. I am your host, Cheryl Ilove, middle-aged ninja hiding in plain sight, dedicated to restoring human dignity one person at a time and helping you unleash your personal power. Discover that it's possible to look like a woman, act like a lady, move like a ninja, and think like a warrior. And remember, men are always welcome on the FemiNinja Project. Welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project, and we are all about empowerment, education, self-education, community, society, and how to make the world a better place. And today's guest is going to tell us a lot about that. Her name is Claudia Hawley, and she is the founder and owner of Stoney Creek Counseling. This is actually her second career. She is a small business owner who really decided to pursue a career in mental health. And she is currently working on her Master's of Arts in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Department at the Denver Seminary. Claudia is also an advocate for the prevention of sexual abuse of children and vulnerable adults, as well as the prevention and awareness of human trafficking. So Claudia, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me, Cheryl. And I wanted to start by telling our listeners that we're going to be talking about pornography today. It's going to be, some people might find this a little rough. And so we always like to give a trigger warning if at any point during our conversation, if any of our listeners do begin to feel very upset, we're going to ask them to stop, to turn off the podcast. And then if they need to, Cheryl, it would be great to provide the Colorado Mental Health Services crisis line number if someone needed emergency help, because this can be a very upsetting topic.
Claudia, could you just do that right now? Do you have that information?
I do. Okay. Yeah, it's Colorado Crisis Services is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week crisis center here in all of the state. They have walk-in centers and they have a 24-hour number, and that number is 1-844-493-8255. That's 1-844-493-8255. And they have trained people there that if you call, they will help you.
Okay, and I do want to just reiterate that we do have listeners all across the United States and even in Canada and UK and a couple of other places, that there are always resources that you can contact if you are feeling uncomfortable or if you do need help. Make sure that you reach out for help, because like Claudia said, this is a difficult topic, but it's one that we felt it wasn't really important to share and to educate people. So be cognizant of how you're feeling as you're listening to this, and if you have to turn it off, turn it off.
Thank you, Cheryl. So I want to tell you a little bit about why this is such a passion for me. I view a lot of us in mental health fields and in education and people who work with children view the issue of pornography as an international public health crisis. This is a problem that impacts across the world. Pornography, online pornography, is the driving force in sex trafficking, in addictions, in mental health problems, increases in depression, anxiety, and suicide. It's just a horrifying problem. And very unfortunately, it's a problem that is hidden in plain sight. What I've noticed is that a lot of parents, just as I'm going about my day and seeing the people that I see in different communities and different groups and just different friend groups, I'll occasionally come across a parent of a teenager and I'll very casually ask, are you checking where they're going online? And almost across the board, the answer will be one of two things. Either no, my son or my daughter is 12 or 14 or whatever age.
Oh.
And there's nothing I can do about where they go online. He's too old for that, or she's too old for that. Or they deny that it will happen. The other thing that happens is a story of brokenness will follow. And I cannot tell you the number of times that I've been in a church group or a meeting of other business owners, and I'll broach the subject and I'll have a mom or dad say, I was careful, but my son's friend wasn't, and his friend showed him pornography and he became addicted. And my 9-year-old was addicted to pornography because he saw it at his friend's house. I have a friend who's a mom of 3 boys, and her kids love Fortnite. They just love Fortnite. And one of them downloaded an app from a friend at school, and this is a mom who checks phones and checks where the kids are online. And she saw that file, and along with it came some pretty graphic pornography. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I want to tell you my own personal story about why this is important to me. When I was a child, I very unfortunately, grew up in a very abusive and neglectful home. When I was 9 or 10 years old, my parents kind of decided to have a second childhood, and I was left in full charge of the home, cooking and cleaning for a family of 6, doing all the laundry, all the housework, and then caring for my younger brother and sister. And I think that's when I first experienced depression, even though I didn't know what it was. And my parents were very cold, and they were very critical because a 10-year-old can't do all those things. And so I was punished pretty severely for not being able to do all those things to perfection. But as I grew, my parents really always saw me as someone who just wasn't ever going to win. And when I was 19, my parents decided that it would be good for me to marry my high school boyfriend. And his parents really saw him as someone who was destined for greatness, and they didn't want him languishing on his own with no one to do the heavy lifting and the cooking and cleaning. So I literally, at the age of 19, ended up in an arranged marriage.
Ugh.
Very unhappy marriage. Very, unfortunately, I don't know what happened to my former husband in his early life that made him into a person who was cruel. But the other thing that later in life I realized was the problem is he was a sex addict. He had a pornography addiction, but back then it was much harder to access. And I kept coming across all the magazines, and then he would act shameful, and then it would all happen again. Well, that, not too long after we were married, that started manifesting in sexual escapades and one-night stands with women outside of the marriage. There could have been hundreds of women. I have no way of knowing. We were married 10 years. Wow. And when he decided that he found someone else to marry and he asked me for a divorce, he had just broken up with this most recent woman that he cheated on me with. And that was just a mess. And I documented about 30 women that I knew about. Oh. And it wasn't that he was so much that he was unfaithful. He was an addict. He was a sexual addict. And I didn't know. But what that does to a young woman who has hope in her marriage, it was devastating. And I took all that wounding with me forward into my later life. And I always was very aware of this heaviness and this sadness. And I think that's what really drew me when I started doing suicide and crisis intervention work. It was like to alleviate some of that suffering, not ever knowing that I had lived in the trauma of a partner who was a sex addict. And so as time went on, I worked as a suicide and crisis intervention volunteer and trainer for a long time. And then I got busy with my business and it became successful. And I got into my 60s. In fact, when I was 61, I'm like, well, I don't want to retire because I don't know how to play golf, and I never learned to play bridge. I don't know what I'm going to do. But I always had this desire to alleviate suffering around me. And it was somewhat of a spiritual experience the day that God revealed to me that he wanted me to go and work in the field of mental health. And then I applied to and I went to seminary. And as I got to know other counseling professionals, I became aware of sex addiction and the role of pornography in our current culture. And it's just really shocking.
So Claudia, can I ask you was that when you realized what your husband's addiction was
Mm-hmm.
all those years later when you started going into your program and talking to other healthcare professionals, or did you find that out prior to this time?
No, see, I had very focused on my small business, and I hadn't really delved into mental health very deeply, other than the work I did in crisis intervention, which the goal was to get someone to a safe place and get them into some kind of treatment so their crisis could be dealt with. And the way I became aware is I just was really lucky in my journey in that I met a counselor that has many certifications. He's a very gifted person, and this counselor he's a certified sex addiction therapist. And as I got to know kind of what he did, and then as I went through my counseling classes at Denver Seminary, I started realizing that, there's something there. And then what really did it for me is there were two things. I met a woman at church who was telling me about her son, who she homeschooled and was very protective of, who had the one dumb friend, and he ended up addicted to pornography.
Oh.
And then my friend, who is the certified sex addiction therapist, or a CSAT, I've heard him speak at one of the presentations he did. He spoke about sex addiction. He talked about that people in his field see children as young as 9 years old.
Oh.
The other thing that was so heartbreaking were all the young women that I started to meet that were my peers, who are in their 20s and their early 30s, who went into marriage with husbands that had sex addictions, all from online pornography.
Oh.
And the impact that it has on those relationships and how hard they have to fight for connection. Because here's what happens. What a lot of people don't know is that pornography is addictive. And that happens, there are a lot of different reasons that happens, but the two basic reasons are, and I don't want this to sound judgmental in any way, because technology is part of our lives, and we're never going to have a situation where our kids are not going to use technology. Our goal should be to build resilience in our children so that when they are confronted with things that are hard or dysregulating, they'll know what to do. But what happens, what a lot of people don't realize, is that when we look at our screen, our cell phone screen, we get a little hit of dopamine. And that impacts, that touches the pleasure center of our brain. That's why if we're stressed and we just scroll through Instagram or Facebook, we feel a little better. It doesn't solve the problem. And dopamine is a really tricky substance, because the more you have, the more you need. It's like an opioid.
Mm-hmm.
Dopamine and the reaction you have, the pleasure you get from looking at a screen, is the same center of the brain that opioids impact. So a screen addiction and a pornography addiction and a heroin addiction all impact the same center of the brain. So when we're like busy and frustrated and harried and rushed, and we're taking care of our little kids and they're fussing, and we hand them a screen, it satisfies them and makes them happy. But if we do that too much, instead of turning and offering them a human connection, an interpersonal connection, they'll begin to think that screens are how they self-soothe instead of a human connection. Scientific evidence and research has shown that screens do activate the same portion of the brain that opioids do. And in fact, I don't remember how recently it is, but in childcare centers, they're no longer allowed to use screens more than 30 minutes a day, or there's something like that. But it is a real problem, because what the child needs, it gets into attachment, where if we're not securely attached as children, then that informs every relationship we have for the rest of our life. And we are either securely attached, or we can be insecurely attached. And what that looks like, we're either anxiously attached, where are you, where are you, where are you, I don't see you, you need to come back, come back, come back, I don't trust that you're going to come back. Or we're avoidant. It's like, I don't need you anyway, I don't need you, I'm going to be compulsively self-reliant, I'm not going to ask anyone for anything because it's so painful, and I'm going to suppress all of my connection needs. So the thing that happens with kids on screens is pornography and the pornographers, and the biggest purveyor of pornography in the world is, I think it's Geek Mind, and they own and run Pornhub, and they now are using childhood characters to market Dora the Explorer, My Little Pony, SpongeBob SquarePants. All the little characters that our little kids love are being used in conjunction with marketing Pornhub. I'll give you a real life example. I love getting my pedicures. That's the thing that's what we love. And I was at the spa where I go, and a lot of times in my travels around Denver, I'll broach the topic and I'll see if there's an opening. And I broached the topic with the woman who was working the front desk, and she said, my 9-year-old was looking up My Little Pony on the internet, and she ended up in a pornography site where it was a group of people that used My Little Pony as a fetish. And she kept going back for 3 weeks before her mother figured it out. So now that little child has 3 weeks, and this is not the kind of pornography that the kids are finding their way into. Isn't Playboy. It is graphic. 98% of the people portrayed in pornography are trafficked. It's brutal, violent, and it is filmed, and it is marketed, and a large number of the people being perpetrated against on the pornography that's available to our children are children themselves. And Pornhub does this with impunity. The amount of money they make is appalling. The porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. 1/3 of all web downloads in the U.S. are porn-related. Pornhub describes itself as the world's leading free porn site. They received 42 billion visits in 2019. 50% of parents underestimate how much porn their teens are seeing. And in a meta-analysis in 22 studies between 1978 and 2014 from 7 different countries concluded that pornography consumption is associated with the increased likelihood of committing acts of verbal or physical sexual aggression regardless of age. See, what's happening is because as a culture, we have completely denied that we are sexual beings and that part of our identity is our sexual identity. It's about how you identify as male or female, the amount, the degree of male or femaleness that you identify with. Like, I was a real tomboy I still identify as feminine and female, but I was a tomboy, and that's part of the spectrum. Every time we talk to someone, our sexuality is in play. And so what we've done in our culture is we refuse to talk about sexual identity with our teenagers, with our kids as they're growing up. And so they're curious and they want to know, well, what is this all about? And a lot of them turn to pornography to try to understand their own sexual identity because no one will talk to them. No one will talk to them about it. One of the most successful moms I've ever personally known is a very dear friend. She began saying to her sons at a very young age, well, you're going to have these feelings and it's normal. It's normal for you to feel this way. You know, of course, you're feeling like you want to have sex, and that's really normal. And I want to ask you, to really consider maybe waiting. But it's normal that you feel this way. And boy, pornography's out there, but I'm going to ask you not to have that in your mind. Mm-hmm. Of course you want to, but it's just not a good idea. And she would just normalize their feelings and normalize that they were becoming young men and what that meant for them. And because of that, they grew up with a very healthy self-esteem and a very healthy attitude about their relationship with themselves, their relationship to other people. And it was just very normal. Now, there are two really fabulous resources. There's one called, if you have teens or tweens, and you've never had a conversation about sexuality or pornography, this site is called Culture Reframed, and they have an online course that's free for parents of tweens, for parents of teens, and then they have a third course that talks about what happens in the developing brain. And what happens in the developing brain, I think most people, we either remember, if we don't have kids, what it was like when we were going through puberty and adolescence, or we were parents and we witnessed it. And the best way to describe it is when a child starts going through adolescence, their brains reorganize. It's called myelination. Neural pathways that are no longer used go away, and newer pathways that are used the most develop and become very strong. And so if you take an adolescent, boy or girl, and you don't talk to them about their identity development, which is physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual, and intellectual, if you're not addressing the entire development of your young person, they're going to seek the information elsewhere. And during the time of adolescence, it's when you kind of have your first little crush. This is what's supposed to happen. You have your first crush, and you learn how to relate in a different way, and you notice who you're attracted to. And sexual identity development, Cheryl, if you ever want to have me back, we can sure talk about that as a standalone subject. It's too much to get into here. But that's what adolescents are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be learning how to be in relationship with peers, with parents, with family. And then their neural pathways and their brains that are going through this myelination process, then those pathways become strong. I know how to connect. I know what kind of friends that make me the happiest. I know what kind of friends don't make me the happiest. I know how to relate to my family. And then from that adolescent experience, they can build on it and then form a little bit later their first romantic attachments where they're actually going into dating. What's happened when we have pornography exposure as young as 3 years old, if you hand your child a mobile device or a wireless device and there are no parental controls on it, the predators are looking for your children. The minute they're online unprotected, they become inventory and they become prey. So if you have an adolescent boy or girl And they're like, well, I'm having all these feelings and I keep hearing about sex, but no one that I love and trust will talk to me about it. So I'm going to look online and I'm going to see what it's all about. And they see horrific, graphic, violent scenes. They're going to think that's what relationships are about. And then because of the dopamine hit they're getting every time their brain sees that, they, a lot of time, not every child, but they go back and they go back and they go back. And their normal development of forming bonds and relationships with peers, which are age appropriate, and they're kind of exploring who am I attracted to and what does that mean, and forming those first relationships. Instead of that, they're seeing graphic pornographic images, and their sexual identity, their sexual script, what they think is normal, what is stimulating for them, goes offline and becomes based in pornography. And what that looks like as time goes on is the fastest growing population for erectile dysfunction. I think the ages are 16 to 34. Oh. Young men can no longer become aroused with a person. They're not aroused by being close or being intimate with a person. They have to have images, so their stimulus response cycle goes offline, and they're not able to enter into relationship.
You are doing such a beautiful job of explaining this, especially, in a scientific neurological way of how the brain actually changes.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I really want to emphasize for my listeners, is that the brain is actually changing and normalizing what it sees. So if it sees something that's a little bit violent, it's like, oh, okay. And then eventually that's normal. So you takes it to the next level, more violent, until it gets to the point where, oh, well, that's just normal behavior. And that's something in the brain called neuroplasticity, that the brain is always able to change, and like it's always listening and logging the information that it sees or hears.
Yes. And in the time of adolescence is the time of greatest neuroplasticity and the myelination. The brain is actually reorganizing, and that can last from whenever the child enters adolescence all the way through their late 20s to early 30s. Your brain is reorganizing, and you're going through that myelination process. And so I'd like that you clarified that what we're facing is that so many young people today, girls included, this is not boys only. One statistic I heard, and I've been repeated to me by people I trust, and I wasn't able to find the source, is that 9 out of 10 of our boys and 6 out of 10 of our girls are regular consumers of online pornography by the time they're 18. Oh. And women now are catching up to men in sexual addiction and pornography addiction. And along with that comes their inability to securely attach in meaningful adult lifelong relationships with friends, with a partner. And they're left alone and isolated in depression, in anxiety, in isolation. And they don't understand that it's not normal because it's all they've ever known. And the biggest driver of that is we don't have a way, or our culture just won't talk about that our sexual identity is part of our development process. So if we have this happening to young people, to the massive, and this is not just a problem in America, it is an international, worldwide problem. And in that, so we have all the individual brokenness, we have all the broken marriages, or the families that never form, or just the inability to even form relationships for people that are severely addicted. It's a compulsion that they just can't stop. And I know some of the parents that are my friends have talked about, they'll say to one of their teenagers, okay, it's time to stop playing Fortnite and go to bed. And they've witnessed how their teen physically cannot stop, that the parent has to remove the gaming console to get the child to stop. And so imagine behind closed doors, if your child is someone who takes their cell phone to bed at night and there's no monitoring of what happens, imagine what that's like. It's been described as sending your child to bed with access to their phone is like taking them to the most dangerous part of your city and leaving them overnight and then coming and getting them in the morning and expecting it to be okay. The answer is, there's a simple answer, and it can be very hard to execute on. And that's where we start building resilience in our children from the beginning, that we make it normal and okay. And these are hard conversations to have, Cheryl. They are hard conversations to have with your kids. Culture Reframed can help with that. If your kids are tweens or teens and you've never talked about this, they have classes, online classes for free that will walk a parent through the dangers, the risks, and then help them with how to have those conversations. If you have little bitty kids, there's another website called Protect Young Minds, and I'll make sure you have these resources. And they have a series of resources that are all free that you start when the kids are really little. The lady who does that website wrote a book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. And what we're doing is unrealistic to think our kids are never going to see porn on the internet. What is realistic is that we can build resilience, we can educate, we can talk to them. If you see something scary, come tell me. We can do parental controls. There's some of the resources I'll provide has a list of software you can use, or you can all do parental blocks. Another real successful couple that I know that got boys all the way through high school, and we didn't have issues with consumption or addiction with pornography, but those parents did something, and they're my heroes. The father was a pretty no-nonsense, very loving dad, but very no-nonsense. And he simply told them, I'm monitoring, and I better not see that crap on your phone. And so they knew their dad to be someone who does what he says what he does. And so, but he also had conversations with them about, athletics and achieving in school and, just, the whole package as far as fatherhood. Mm-hmm. But what the mom did is, they were a baseball family, and she would get those, it was a boys baseball team, and she would drive the boys, they would drive those kids all over Colorado on the weekends. But she would get a carload of boys, and somewhere along the trip, she would tell them they all had to turn off their phones, and she would talk to them about life. And she would say to them, now, don't sext. She was a chiropractor, and so she had a lot of law enforcement would come in and say, this is what happened in this high school. And she would come in and say, don't sext. And she would talk to them about what that meant. Don't be taking pictures and sending them, because if you get one, erase it. Don't screenshot it, erase it. Because if they find it on your phone, that's illegal, and you're going to lose everything, which happens. If teenagers get caught sending sexual pictures of each other back and forth, that's a law enforcement issue. And they can end up as a registered sex offender if they're caught doing that. It's serious, and the consequences are very dire. And so she would just have these conversations about life and about goals and about things not to do. And it actually saved one young man. He got his little ring of students at his high school. They were all sexting. Oh. And he saw it come up on his phone, and Dr. Don's voice rang in his head, and he deleted it. And when they all got called in, because they knew that they were like a group of kids that all hung out, and they checked all their phones. And he was known as somewhat of a ringleader. When they checked his phone, they found nothing. And his mom asked him later, she goes, how did you not get caught doing that? And he says, Dr. Don told me not to.
Wow.
And see, it's as simple as a conversation, and it is as hard as a conversation. But these resources, Culture Reframed and Protect Young Minds, will have resources that are accessible and they're free, and they'll help you begin that conversation with your kids.
Well, even going back to, bless that mom, Dr. Dawn,
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
I'm here just kind of like bowing at her feet, even though
she's my hero. I love her so much.
I'm thinking of peer pressure, because we all know as teenagers, the incredible peer pressure that that young man may have been experiencing even when he saw that photo on his phone, but yet her voice her teaching overrode that. And the fact that she was talking to a group of these boys together as she was driving, probably in the minivan, taking them to the baseball games, that kind of different kind of peer pressure, that they were all hearing it together.
They were hearing it together.
Yeah, so it actually kind of strengthened that bond rather than, I'm going to be the odd man out.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is that when she would talk to them out of love and compassion and respect for them as young men. And they knew that from her. They knew that that Dr. Dawn was someone who had their back. And that's just something that they knew about her. But another thing research shows, there's a very wonderful organization here in Denver called Girl Above. Krista DeYoung is the woman who heads that up, and her whole thing is working on self-esteem and building self-esteem in girls. And she's quoted things that say the number one influence in a child or teen's life is their parent. And that what a lot of most teens long for is to be seen and to be heard by their parent. The thing that's so challenging is that when kids enter adolescence and their brains start to reform and start to reorganize, they go through the equivalent of a second toddlerhood. And it can be, and puberty can hit some kids really hard. But that's when parents, it's hard to stand your ground, and the constant upset and the constant battles that you fight with kids. And that's when they need you, just like when they were toddlers, to keep those boundaries, even though it's really going to be hard. And sometimes it's okay to get professional mental health intervention if your child has been particularly hard hit by puberty and you just need some coaching. Sometimes that can be a real lifeline for parents. So I just want to mention that too. But what they yearn for is to be seen and heard, and valued, which are as simple as, if it's possible, and this is easier to do with starting when the kids are really little, is that there can be a time and space and it can be a physical space, like when you drive them home from school, or as you're fixing dinner, or right when they get home from school, but some time and space where your child is allowed to say anything and tell you anything without you responding or in correcting or telling them or trying to fix the problem or trying to tell them they've done something wrong, just to give them that time to say what's on their heart. And it's so hard. And I know I just don't want to sound like I am trying to tell parents that this one counselor sitting here on your podcast is telling them all the things they're doing wrong. That's not, I hope I don't sound like
No,
that.
you're not coming across that
okay,
way at
good.
all. It's
because it's
at all. It's very supportive. It's educational and very helpful.
Yeah, because it's hard. And part of the reasons that parents have such a hard time facing the fact that this might be happening to their teenager is because we as a species are hopeful, such hope in our children. We take such delight in our children that we could never imagine them going to this dark place 10 feet away in their bedroom. Right. It doesn't even occur to us that this is happening to our teens. But the one thing that you absolutely have to remember is that if there is one group of people that know how addictive pornography is, it's the porn industry and They also know if they can addict a person when they're a child, and they can get them while their brains are myelinating during the adolescent process, those become very, very entrenched neural pathways. And when those kids turn 18, they're all going to have credit cards. You will get a lot more of the specific information at Culture Reframed. Those resources and those video courses are amazing. Now, I want to talk for a minute. If you're a parent and you all of a sudden are like, oh, I got to have this conversation with my teenager. And if you find out that your teenager is not only consuming, but becoming addicted to pornography, to not lose heart, because there is hope and there is help. And there are highly trained mental health professionals that know how to walk a child out of pornography. And we're really blessed here in the Denver area to have some pretty gifted therapists that know how to deal with sex addiction. And I'll make sure, Cheryl, that you have a list of resources for that.
Okay.
So because if parents begin now to have these conversations, it's going to be hard for them if they discover that their teen, and this counts for girls too. Young women, girls and young women are becoming addicted to pornography. They're developing sex addictions as well because their brains myelinate the same way. And if you think the pornographers have forgotten about women, they actually have developed specialized pornography for women, and it's relationship porn. A mainstream example is 50 Shades of Grey. That's pornography. And we've normalized it. And we think the popular opinion is, oh, wow, it's just a bit of naughtiness. Well, it's not. It's a gateway into hardcore addiction.
Ugh.
But awareness is the first step. And it's hard to think of your child, that your child is seeing pornography. But if you have a child and they have access to the internet, and and even if you have child safeties on at home, they're all going to have one dumb friend.
Mm-hmm.
They're all going to have one dumb friend. And I've heard that story over and over. One very tragic one was a woman that I knew socially, whose son had the one dumb friend. And this child, this also leads to children perpetrating against children.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the teenagers or the adolescents are looking at pornography, if that's how sex works, there actually are cases of brutalizing one another. And pediatricians are beginning to see injuries in their practices that they usually only see in sex workers.
Oh.
You know, Cheryl, I have to tell you, preparing to come and talk to you today, I kind of went into a depressed place again.
Aww.
Because I went back and I looked at some of the videos. Gail Dines has a YouTube or has a TED Talk, and she also has, I'll make sure you have it, Exodus Cry podcast number 67. Mm-hmm. She doesn't pull any punches when she talks about this issue. But I got a little down again because the problem can feel overwhelming. But the more we talk about it and the more we stand with and for parents and provide resources and help them truly be a community that loves and values our children, the easier, the better it will be to end the plague on our culture.
It takes an incredible amount of courage to talk about it. So I take my hat off to you. I'm bowing at your feet too.
Oh, Cheryl.
Having the courage to talk about it in such a candid and frank and honest manner. Thank you so much for being here today and explaining this in such, again, open, honest, and compassionate way. And before we sign off, how can people get a hold of you? And we will have this listed on the episode as well. So it will always be there, but just go ahead and give us that information now.
Okay. The best way is just to email me, Claudia at StoneyCreekCounseling.com. And Cheryl, I just want to share one more thing. I am an apprentice with another organization called Cassett Wellness, and Cassett Wellness provides affordable mental health care for the uninsured. And right now we have a program for displaced workers of COVID-19 where we can provide 12 sessions of therapy for free.
Wow.
To qualifying people.
Okay.
And so, and I'll make sure you have that resource too, or they can email me, but I'll make sure you have Kesset Wellness as well. They're a wonderful organization.
Okay, great. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming and sharing this information. And yeah, it's tough to hear. It's tough to talk about. But, you know, we have just got to do better as a society, as a community, and even just starting, you know, with your own home, your own family units and friends, to be able to talk about this, because it's abhorrent, and it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that if we can all open our eyes and our voices and help shine this light on such a horrible, you know, I can't even talk about it.
Yeah.
That hopefully we can do something about it, and we can eliminate this, and we can end it and protect our kids.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks to my listeners. Thanks for hanging in there, because it really is a tough conversation, but one that we just simply have to have, because self-awareness, self-education is how we can really make a difference in the world. And that is the way of the FemiNinja. And that's a wrap on another episode of the FemiNinja Project. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, be safe, be strong, and until next time, bye now.